All right, let's talk about why startup investors should not be worshiped. Hi, everyone. Hope you're having a great day. We're going to talk about the idea that startup investors should not be worshiped. Now, if startup founders are the modern day rock stars, that would typically make startup investors their producers, because a lot of people see the idea of the startup investor turning the startup into something special because of the capital that they put into the business. And this is not entirely true. Now, what's got me thinking about this, by the way, is a podcast that I enjoy watching called the Wharton, which is the Wharton University or Wharton Graduate School, Wharton FinTech podcast. And on there, the host, Miguel, interviewed a gentleman named Craig Lewis. And Craig has a startup called Gig Wage, and it basically handles payroll and wages for gig workers or freelancers. Check it out if you want to. It's a really cool idea. As part of that interview, Craig came on and made the comment that he felt like a lot of startup founders and people in the startup community basically bow down to and worship startup investors. And I tend to agree. I have seen this a lot with startup founders. They sort of worship at the feet of the startup investors. They kowtow to them. They bow down to them. They sort of beg for money from startup investors. And I'm not sure that's really the way the relationship should be. So bear with me while I work through this. Certainly, startup investors putting capital into a startup is important, particularly for high growth startups. You're just not going to survive unless you can get funding. You're not going to get your idea off the ground, even in many instances. You know from watching me, there are models like the lean startup model where you can spin up a business and run it very lean and accomplish some milestones. But if your startup is going to be a high growth one, or just requires a lot of capital because maybe you're doing a ton of R&D research for a science startup, then you're going to need startup investors. But I don't think it's a situation where startup founders should be bowing down to these startup investors, basically begging them for money. And the reason I feel that way is, if you think about it, it's not the startup investors that are actually producing the results. Certainly they go out, they pull together investment capital, and they have to manage it, and they manage their startups, and they add input and all those kinds of things. But the real result is coming from the startup founder and startup itself. Without those companies being successful and returning the investment and then some back to the startup investors, then we really wouldn't have anything happen. So it's the startup founders that are really accomplishing the results. So in my opinion, and it sounded like what Craig was saying as well, and like I said, I'm tending to agree with him at this point, it's the startup investors that really should be looking for the startup founders. Now, this is a two-way street. It's a very symbiotic relationship. One cannot survive with the other. But in most instances, you have startup investors who are looking at, hundreds of deals before they fund a single one of them. And so they're looking at deal after deal after deal after deal, and it just goes on and on and on. And so what they're really looking for is a quality deal. And a lot of the startup investors that I talk to have told me that it's not a matter of deal flow, meaning seeing lots of opportunities. It's a matter of they're not seeing enough quality opportunities. So if you're a startup founder with a really great idea, you've accomplished some great milestones, then you, in reality, should be in the driver's seat, particularly if you are that one investable good idea. Remember, startup investors are putting money into one investable idea, and a bunch of them are failing, and they need the return from one good exit to return all of their investments and then some. So as the startup founder of a really quality business with a great model, a great team, a unique selling proposition, all these different things, you are the one that should be in the driver's seat, not the startup investors. Now, it takes being in that place, right? Most of the startups I work with are not in that place. It's not that unique of an idea. They don't have that good of a team. And there's all these different things they're missing. So if you build to the point where you're in the driver's seat, it's not that I'm saying the investors should come bow down and worship you, but it becomes a more symbiotic 50-50 relationship instead of a startup founder having to run around and beg investors for money. So just know that startup investors are really important. I know it's important to you as a startup founder to get that investment because you want your baby, your startup to grow. But if you do the right things, you're the one that should be in the driver's seat, not chasing after all these startup investors. In many instances, if you do it the right way, you can have multiple offers on the table and take the one with the startup investor that can add the most to your startup. I hope that information helps. Until next time, hope you find your voice. Have a great day.